All right, this is the second video recorded from my students. We're going to talk about the growth of markets. I'm going to let all this come down here. So in free trade, and my other subject that I teach currently is AP Macroeconomics. And we talk a lot about GDP. And GDP is gross domestic product. It's a good thing for you to know the definition of if you're a serious AICE European student. It's the amount of goods and services produced in a country in a year. And the other name for it is national income. And so anyway, England is very involved with free trade, and let me give you the reasoning behind free trade being a good thing. Some people think it isn't, but many people think it is. The theory is that if you have two countries, and one is good at making cars, and the other one is good at making computers, the one that's really good at making cars should make the cars, and the other one should make the computers, and they should trade. So they're able to have more cars and computers than they would have if they tried to make them all themselves individually. So that is the benefit of free trade. And England is a leader in free trade. It has no serious competition. And here's all the reasons. It had the infrastructure there. Now, infrastructure is another word you need to know. It's the roads and the bridges and the highways and the railways and the canals and the ports and the merchant marine. It's all there. In today's world, we refer to infrastructure like as our highways, our cell phone towers, our internet lines, our 5G service, our airports, our runways, our highways, anything that helps make us productive. There were ports, and I'm not going to go over this. I've talked about most of this. There's a good banking system, and there's insurance companies that allow you to preserve a lot of your investments. 1783, as soon as the American Revolution is over, they sign a peace treaty. Why? They want the war to be over, and they want to do business with the United States. So the United States is the offspring of England, and we are cast in their same design. We're going to be a rich capitalist country. And we have people beating down the doors to get over here because we have so much stuff. Capitalism made that possible. They also recognized the new South American countries because they wanted to keep doing business with them. So Britain is all about the money. You might want to write that down, circle it, and underline it there. All about the money. Okay, moving on here. There's tariffs, and I'm not going to tell the Harley-Davidson story. My stories are for my students in the classroom. But a tariff is a tax on a good coming into a country. So the story we're going to talk about here in a few minutes is the corn laws. The British farmers raised corn, the rich British farmers, but corn was grown cheaper in other countries. And so what the British poor people were doing is they were buying corn from other countries. Well, the rich British farmers wouldn't complain to Parliament, and Parliament added a tariff which made the foreign-grown corn more expensive. And so these greedy farmers made corn expensive for the poor. Remember, we're going to be talking a lot about capitalism, and capitalism is a lot like everything else. There's some good things to be said about it, and some bad things to be said about it, and this is a bad thing. All right, we're going to skip all these essay topics. What happened what was the result of urbanization? The British went from 15% living in towns to 25% to over 50% in our time period. 1750 to 1850, the years that bookend this time period. Unit 2 in AICE European History. Going to ignore that. Anyway, some facts here. You need to know what a census is. A census is when they tried to count everybody in the country. The first one done in Britain was done in 1801. I think our first one was 1790. I'm not an American history teacher. But in the United States, every 10 years they count the population. And that's what determines how many representatives each state has. I live in Florida. Florida is always gaining population and more power in Congress. And New York is continually losing population and losing representation. There's a lot of other things going on. Agriculture is being more productive. They don't need all those big workforces. There's no restrictions on the movement of people. And there's all sorts of new jobs opening up. If you're going to be living in a city, they need stores. So they need goods to be sold in the stores, and they need people to sell them. As more people learn to read, you're going to need cheap newspapers. You're going to need reporters. As the middle class, now the middle class is a new thing. There has not been much of a middle class in England, but as it grew, they wanted their kids to be educated. And obviously transport is a major deal here, because you can move raw materials in and finished goods out. These are push and pull factors. And I'm going to just skip over this, but this is part of the dark underbelly of capitalism, at least during this time period. People leave the country. Now, they were very poor out in the country, right? But they had room to be poor in. They had open fields. They knew a lot of the people in town. When they started moving into the cities, and a lot of building entrepreneurs built land near the cities, which sounds good. If you're going to be working 14 hours a day, you want to be able to walk to work, right? But these cities, as time goes by, are belching out pollution and smoke. And so you basically lived in this nasty, filthy, dirty part of town. They built small apartments. They built them tall and close. As time goes by, a lot of people would use the word ghetto, but that word is a later invention, I believe. As I associate it with the Holocaust in Eastern Europe, they're going to call these apartment buildings tenements. They are rife with disease. The one you want to pay special attention to is cholera. How do you pronounce it? Cholera, which come from contaminated water supplies. And what's happening is sewage is just being dumped out in the streets. And so people are being exposed to filthy, infected water, and that is causing cholera to kill people. Crime is bad. It's dangerous. The local governments were not up to it. And the rich could just leave and go to the suburbs. In American history, we've had a lot of problems with the poorer people, many of them racial minorities, being stuck in the middle of town. As the situation deteriorates downtown, the rich people, many of them white, could escape the urban city centers and go out into the suburbs. And in this country, which is not part of AICE European, I'm talking about the United States, trying to make some connections. For a while during the 70s and 80s and 90s, that was called white flight. So they didn't call it that in England, but the rich have the money to get out of these urban hellholes, and the poor people are left. They're not going to tell that story on YouTube. This is a famous drawing from the time of an inner city tenement. And what you see here, if you can see my cursor, is a factory sitting up there on the hill belching smoke. And these people are doing their laundry, hanging out their laundry, and it's just being covered with soot from all that coal smoke. These are actual pictures of people living jammed into these apartments. There's no running water. People would go to the bathroom in a bucket and just throw it out the window. Imagine how upset you'd be if you're walking along the street and somebody dumps a bucket of feces on your head. This is probably England, but could just as easily be inner city Chicago or New York City. Many of these are tenements, and you can see how the people are jammed in on top of each other. All right. So now there's this guy. He's very important. You need to know who he is. His name is Edwin Chadwick. And I don't think I have any pictures of him in this lecture because my kids did a homework assignment on him. What you need to know is he's a disciple of Jeremy Bentham, who's this guy who came up with this theory that what we ought to do as a government is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And that was called utilitarianism. And the person who put all this into practice was his disciple, Chadwick. And his big issue, and I need to stress this because I don't think I have enough of him in this lecture, is that he was brought in to try to help in the cholera outbreak, and he realized the problem was the sewage disposal. So you need clean water being brought into the houses and filthy, dirty sewage water being taken out of the city in underground septic pipes. So he is going to be pretty important, and he's going to save a lot of lives. All right, moving on here. There's a lot of things that are bad about the urban work. Again, this is the ugly underbelly of capitalism. People work 12 to 14 hours a day. Work was tedious. 65% of the textile mills were women and children. The employees were women and children. I'm not a fan of socialism. I am, however, a big fan of Robert Owen. He was a rich guy who really tried to care for his employees. And they those people earned the name utopian socialist. Karl Marx, who I'm not sure yet we're going to talk about in AICE, He did not show up in Unit 2, and he should have, because in 1848 he wrote his masterpiece, The Communist Manifesto, while he was living in England. He had nothing but disdain for people like Owen. I have a pretty high opinion of Owen. And like many of these people who tried to help the poor, he lost all of his money, and ultimately his project, which he brought to the United States, failed. If you ever study socialism in the United States, you learn about Robert Owen. And socialism failed here like it has everywhere else. Many workers were killed in the factories, and they were injured or killed, and not only did they generally not get their medical bills paid, when they died, their family got no money. Very, very sad situation. How did this affect the social classes? England was not as structurally, the social structure was not fixed. It was somewhat fluid, which meant it was entirely possible, unlikely maybe, but possible that a rich person would fall in love with and marry a poor person. In a lot of societies, that just would not have happened. A rich person would not have met a poor person unless they were working in their house as a maid or a butler. But England was not as socially stratified. The aristocracy was still dominant, but it was beginning to lose its power, because we're going to learn there's this new class growing up called the middle class. There were public schools, but they weren't really what we call public. They were privately run. I teach at a large public high school, the largest one in Orange County, Florida, currently. And a few years ago, we fed our kids free breakfast, free lunch, and free supper. Is this a great country or what? And so it's a very large public school where the kids all have a computer. And so that is what our modern day concept of a public school. These back then that they're calling public schools are really private schools, and the poor simply did not go. Now, England is a constitutional monarchy. You want to asterisk that in your notes, which means there is a king, but he's limited by the Constitution. He's got a fair amount of power, but the Parliament has more power than him. And England still has, to this day, 2024, a constitutional monarchy. What does the king do? I'm not sure anybody really knows, or the queen, but they still have one. What else we got here? Now, this is the biggest social change of the Industrial Revolution, the growth of the middle class. Before 1750, you always had doctors and lawyers, which had more money, less money than the rich, but more money than the poor. But as time goes by, industrialization is going to add lots of people to this group. I explain to my students, I don't know that they appreciate this, but that part of the reason colleges were started in the United States is the people that own businesses needed to hire people to run them for them. And so if you're poor and you manage to get a college scholarship, or you go to college, or you work your way through college, or you get an athletic scholarship, you can get a degree in accounting or taxation or engineering, and you can get hired by these rich companies to work for them. So if you're in the lower classes and you want a decent middle class lifestyle, college gives you the opportunity to escape, some of the economic vicissitudes of being poor, and rise to the level of the middle class. And so this is a growing thing then, and still it's a growing thing now. And the new middle class had surplus wealth. There's that word again. And they demanded servants and luxury goods. And I threw this term in. I don't know if it actually applies. I believe this is a French term. And again, came into common usage in the American lexicon back about the 1970s, 1980s, when I was in the business world. These people are becoming the nouveau rich, the new rich, or the nouveau riche, however this is pronounced in French. Now, I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff. I find this stuff very boring. I just want you to understand that the working class was the lower class, but they were not all the same. There were basically three categories. There were unskilled laborers who had it really bad because they weren't really good at anything. Here, move this box. They were subject to frequent unemployment. Then they were the semi-skilled. They had some basic skills in a certain area. And the group that had it best were the highly skilled laborers. And these people actually had it fairly good for being a member of the lower class. The really lower level people needed their spouses and kids to work because they needed all the incomes to work. I live in a formerly agricultural area. I live in Orange County, Florida. And a lot of the families that came here to pick oranges years ago, most of our orange trees are dead. The name survives, and our school is near this road called the Orange Blossom Trail, but the orange trees are mostly gone. But what happened was they would keep their kids out of school, not because they didn't want them to go to school, but they needed them to work in the fields to make more money for them. So it's fairly similar here. These people needed to work, everybody in the family, simply so their kids had food to eat. Eventually, the cheap rail transport is going to make it easy to look for work. Wages were low and they were often paid in company currency. The skilled workers, as I said earlier, were much better off. Now, what you're about to see here, we're getting close to the end of the unit, is the government is starting to take notice. Okay? And what generally happens, at least in American society and British society as well, you have all these upper class men. What are they doing? They're going to work every day. But they've got these rich wives who are sitting around with nothing to do. And a lot of them became what I guess you would call now in American culture a social warrior. Except it meant something then. They went out and they became very interested in how are the poor living and how can we help them. So they start to pressure their husbands, who pressure Parliament, let's do something to help the poor. So this time period, there's going to start to be a movement to try to help them and to pass some laws to help them. And there's a lot of stuff here. Of course, the employers argued, we don't think market conditions in capitalism should be regulated. That's called the value of the free market. As an economics teacher, I have a fair amount of belief in that. But you do need to regulate capitalism, and in my opinion, some. And of course, the poor would say, of course, the rich don't think we need rule. They need to follow the rules. They think we should follow the rules. But there's all sorts of different opinions. But England is going to lurch toward trying to protect the poor. Okay? All right. There is the Tories. Later on, they're called the Conservative Party. They still exist in England, and they are comparable to the American Republican Party. The British, later on, we're going to see in this lecture, they have a party called the Whigs. So did the United States, by the way. And in both the United States and England, the Whigs die away. And in England, the replacement party is called the Labour Party, and that is comparable to the party in the United States called the Democratic Party. Now, what started all the reform movements? A letter to a newspaper. If you're taking notes, you really want to circle this and asterisk this. And here is a copy of the letter. I'm not going to read this to you, but the big thing in the 1830s was they were trying to outlaw slavery, which was interesting because there was no slavery in England. The slavery existed in England's former colonies like the United States. So they're trying to free the slaves. And this person wrote a letter to the editor and he goes, listen, we're trying to free the slaves, but right in the middle of our cities, we have children working 14 hours a day in these hellholes called the mills. The mills, you need to know this, is the term used for textile factories. We've got basically child slavery going on here. Why aren't we doing something about that? And this, don't ever let anybody tell you one person cannot make a difference. This one letter, which was published in this newspaper, started this whole reform movement in England. Now it's like everything else. It's going to take years for these changes to take effect, but they are going to take effect. There was a Sadler Committee, and Sadler is a man who was an MP. That does not stand for military policeman in this class. It stands for member of parliament, which is equivalent to an American congressman. Now, the Sadler Committee failed, but then came the Royal Commission, which is just the name of a government committee set up to send a report to the king. We don't even know if the king actually cared, but it still went to him. And this guy, Chadwick, that I should spend more time on, he was on this Royal Commission. And the Royal Commission was effective in changing the conditions in the cities with the situation with bringing in clean water and taking sewage out to end the outbreaks of cholera and to save the lives of many thousands of people. If you believe in this kind of thing, I would call this guy a hero. I'm sad I do not have a picture of him in this lecture. All right, here is some of the testimony they took. You can pause this and read this. I'm not going to read it to you. Here's the first major law passed. I make my students memorize it, so you can pause it and look at this. But I taught AP European history for about 18 years, and this is always on the AP exam. These are the first laws passed, and you can look at this and you can laugh. You can say, oh, they passed a law saying kids under 9 couldn't work. Big whoop, right? But the deal is, this is, as far as I know, the first country in the world to pass a law like this. I'm not sure any law existed like this in the United States. It may have. So there's all sorts of rules, and if you're between the age of 9 and 13, you got to be educated twice a day. I'm sure many of my students think education is a curse. If you talk to somebody who's really poor and they want to escape being poor and to receive a middle-class lifestyle, you know, a lot of them realize education is not a curse. It is a blessing. Okay, many people were disappointed with what this law did, but I always like to point out it's a first step. They're trying to pass some laws. There will be more. Now, in AP European history, you have to memorize a lot of laws. There's only a couple you need to know about in AICE. So anyway, all these changes start happening to start being made, and you can read over this. So they're trying to help people, but the conditions are still pretty bad. Now, here comes some of these protests that are coming up. There were food riots, and after the Napoleonic Wars, many soldiers and sailors came home, and they need work and food, and there are radical newspapers out there instigating protests and riots. So there's starting to be trouble in the streets of England. It is not going to rise to the level of the French Revolution, which happened in the 1700s, because the English had already had a pretty violent revolution in the 1600s. Of course, that is not in the purview of AICE European history as presently constituted. All right, moving on here. 2 riots you need to know about. Number 1 is the Captain Swing riots. Now, there's no person named Swing, but these people are like protesting, and they're burning things and they're destroying things, and they would write letters. I'm going to show you one. It's kind of funny. And they use this name Swing. He's not a real person. But here's the kind of things they were upset about. Lack of regular employment. If you're poor, you need to go to work every day. You can't work 1 week and then be unemployed for 3 weeks and expect to feed your family. They were upset about low wages, bad housing, working conditions. They hated to pay taxes to support the Church of England when they didn't even, many of them, go to any church, or they didn't go to that church. They went to a different one. And they were very upset about these new threshing machines, which made work quicker, which sounds good, but then they needed less employees. I will tell one little story here, even though it probably doesn't belong here. I always tell my students, when I go to a checkout line, I always try to go where there's a cashier rather than go through self-checkout. And I was at Lowe's the other day here in Apopka, and there were no cashiers. And so I went to self-checkout, and there was a lady standing there, and I said, please, can you wait on me? I'm worried one of my students will come by and get a picture of me and call me a hypocrite. I'm a big fan of capitalism, but I want to support people working as much as possible. So I did go through a checkout line, but I made a self-checkout, but I got a worker to come help me through, and she actually rung it all up. And the other thing they were upset about was hunger. That is an ever-present thing with these people. They're on the verge of starvation. So some pictures here. Well, here's what happened with them. You can look at this. The army came in. They killed some people. They put some people in prison. A lot were sent to Australia, which at the time was a penal colony. This is a threshing machine. Very efficient for the time. Doesn't meet as many workers. This is a letter, kind of interesting here. This guy is threatening to burn something down. He goes, at college, I can't read most of this, shall be fired. That means I'm going to burn this down. And he signed it Captain Swing. Or he signed it Swing. Well, there is no swing. This is what you call, and I assume we're going to learn this in Unit 4, a nom de guerre. A lot of, in Russia, you had these revolutionaries, which are very similar to terrorists. And they use nom de guerres, and the most famous is this Georgian named Joseph Zhugashvili, who took the fake name in Russian Man of Steel, which translates as Stalin. And he's going to be known to history as Stalin, but that's not his real name. And so this is a fake name, and they name the whole riots. And there is what this fictitious character, somebody drew him as. This is kind of a joke. Now, the swing riots didn't accomplish a lot. They're not that famous. These are the famous ones. So I'm assuming if you're a AICE European student, that's not one of my students, that your teacher has spent a lot of time on the Luddites. I certainly did. And these were people that sneaked into factories at night and destroyed the machinery. How's the term used today? It refers to people who are uncomfortable with technology. So if you ask a friend to send you a text message, and they say, well, can I just, call you? I'm not good with sending a text on my phone. You can say you're a real Luddite. If they know European history, they'll laugh. If they don't know European history, they're going to think you're strange for making that joke that nobody understands. But that is how the term is used today. There's 2 or 3 famous drawings. This is the most famous. So these guys would sneak in to the factories at night and destroy the machinery. And this is this fictitious person named Lud. I have no idea. And these are all these, drawings of fighting in the factories. This, I think, is the manager coming at night and catching his workers destroying the machines. So now you need to read over this. I'm getting a little tired with this. The lecture's running longer than I want. And for my students, we just talked about this 2 weeks ago. But here are the political and constitutional consequences of this. The government was very pro-industrialization. And down here at the bottom were the first demands for radical change. And you see that name, Thomas Paine, who was a pretty big name in American history. He came over here and wrote this pamphlet for common sense for our revolutionary period. And he's also writing in England. And he's basically saying, here's what we need to solve all these problems for the poor. They set up these things called the corresponding societies. Now, the Corn Laws, you really need to know about. It's a top-tier topic in AICE. And what happened was, I think I referred to this earlier, the rich British farmers were passing these rules, these tariffs on corn coming in. Well, the poor needed that corn to be cheap because they need to feed their families. So the rich, and it's absolutely fair to call them selfish, again, this is the downside of capitalism, they had these tariffs put there, so they made the foreign corn more expensive than theirs, so people bought theirs. Without the tariff, the foreign corn would have been cheaper. So anyway, these people had a meeting in a field, St. Peter's Field. There was a speech going on, and they sent this military force, kind of like a militia called the Yeomanry. They sent them in, and they charged this crowd of 6,000 people and wound up killing 11 people. These are unarmed civilians. So it is absolutely a massacre. And this was nicknamed sarcastically over the most famous battle of the time period, the famous defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. They called this the defeat of Peterloo, right? Because it was St. Peter's Field, but this is a horrible joke. Because Napoleon was fighting against the British and Prussian armies. These were armies fighting. Both sides were armed. This was a group of armed people shooting down probably mostly unarmed or totally unarmed civilians. Here's the next big Reform Act. Going to skip through this. Here's the new Poor Law. There's some interesting stuff here. They made the landowners pay for it. And basically they got money based on the size of the recipient's family. Very similar to the United States. And it varied with the price of bread. Didn't work very well, so they set up a new royal commission in 1832, and they set up these workhouses. Very interesting. So the poor would get money from the government, and they had to show up and work in these workhouses. Well, they separated the men and women because they didn't want the women getting pregnant. And they were made to wear clothing like convicts wear and do boring, monotonous work. And the people who worked there hated them, and then nicknamed them the Bastille, or the Bastilles, after that famous French prison. There's a lot of reforms that are coming up, including Chartism. Now you need to look at all this stuff. The working class was becoming more and more literate, and you're starting to have educated men who can lead the angry working classes. Okay? And the most famous group is the Chartist. I made my kids memorize everything on this list. And if you're going to be successful in this exam, you need to as well. Now, Chartism is named after this People's Charter of 1838. It was not successful, but all these ideas, and there's some really good ideas here, all of them are eventually going to pass in England. So the Chartists failed at achieving what they wanted to do. I kind of compare them to the abolition movement in the United States. For, 70 years, people in the United States tried to abolish slavery. And most of those abolitionists died never seeing the slaves freed. And I guess you could call those people a failure. I would not do that. They fought long and hard in something they believed in. And eventually the curse of slavery was ended in the United States. And so Chartism does not succeed, but all the things these people wanted eventually happens. And I will talk about a few of them. They said, you want to help the poor, give every man in this country the right to vote. And before, you had to own property to stand. That means run for office. Run for parliament, you had to own property. They wanted that law eliminated. The parliaments used to go 2 or 3 years without meeting. They said we should meet every year. Every area should have equal representation. The MPs should get paid. I don't want to veer into politics here, but I will say that I read just today that Trump, again, for his second term as president, is not going to accept any pay. I think the president makes, you could Google this, I think he makes $400,000 a year. And I don't know if any other presidents have ever done that. They may have, but he is not going to take any pay. Of course, he still gets to live in the White House and fly on Air Force One. But back then, members of parliament were rich, so they didn't get paid. Well, what the Chartists want is they want poor people to get elected to the parliament so they can speak for the poor. And so they're saying, hey, you need to pay these people. And when they vote on a law, the ballot should be secret. So no one should know how they voted. All right. I don't actually know if that secret ballot law applied to parliament or voting for office. I should know, but I'm running out of energy for this lecture. They were not successful. You can look over this, but they did change the way England was run eventually. These are all the reasons it failed. You should look over this. They could not agree on their objectives. A lot of revolutionary groups, I probably shouldn't call them a revolutionary group, because they were trying to bring about change peacefully for the most part. But like most revolutionary groups, the analogy is true. They can't agree on their objectives. So the government can drive a wedge amongst the members of the movement because they can't agree on what they stand for. All right, trade unions, I'm just going to let you write this down. They were called combinations during that time. And eventually the parliament would pass laws against them. Here's the goals of the trade unions. And I tell my students I am a member of the teachers union here, which is a trade union, very similar at least to the ones the British had. Here's were the goals. The British passed laws against them called the Combination Acts, but in 1824 they repealed them, so unions became legal, trade unions. Eventually they had these things called cooperative societies. Robert Owen, remember, who I have a really high opinion of, he's not a Marxian socialist. He's a utopian socialist. These are shops controlled by their members, and they had various uses, but these cooperative societies, most important thing for you to know, led to the beginning of the Labour Party in England. As I said earlier, commensurate with our Democratic Party here in the United States. And this is the final lecture, and I am done with this one. I hope this helps somebody somewhere. My email is at the top, so if you want to send me an email to my school address, if this helped you, or you want me to suggest I add something, I made this video because I couldn't find any others on YouTube. If you take AP US History or European History, you know who Heimler is. You certainly must know who that is. Please email him and beg him to make these YouTube videos to help out the AICE students.